Welcome to another edition of A Closer Look with Gary Gulbranson, and I am Gary Gulbranson. I'm a pastoral counselor. Some of you who have tuned into these little blogs know that I oftentimes talk about counseling types of issues. I can tell you that in my 40 years of doing pastoral counseling, there's one issue that I've dealt with more often than any other, and that's the issue of guilt. When we look at guilt from a societal standpoint, we understand that there's legal guilt. If there are laws that I'm supposed to follow and I don't follow those laws, I might be legally guilty. That's like speeding and getting pulled over and getting a ticket. And then there's moral guilt, where we come to understand that God has put a moral structure around us. We know it as the Ten Commandments, and that when we work against his moral structure, even his spirit will remind us of what sin, righteousness, and judgment looks like. And then there are feelings of guilt. That's usually the territory where I find myself at work. So people can deal with legal guilt, and you can often pay a price for that, and then it's gone. Moral guilt's a little harder to deal with, but it's the feelings of guilt that oftentimes hold us in bondage. There's a powerful story in John chapter 8 about a woman who was caught in the very act of adultery. According to the law, legal and moral law, this woman should have been put to death. Not only the woman, but the man who was involved in this as well. But the people who dragged this woman out of that compromising situation were not so concerned about whether she had broken the law. What they were concerned about was how Jesus would handle this. So they dragged this woman from that setting. She was caught in the very act of adultery, drag her through the streets of Jerusalem, throw her down in front of Jesus, and demand that he obey the law. This woman was caught in the act of adultery. She should be put to death. And Jesus doesn't respond immediately. Instead, the Bible tells us he knelt down and he writes on the ground, and then he very quietly says, okay, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And one by one, those accusers of this woman begin to disappear. And I love what the scripture says, from the oldest to the youngest. Certainly older men in that situation would have been aware of lots of things in their life that perhaps they had not dealt with, sins that were there and had produced their own level of guilt. And so one by one they disappear, from the oldest to the youngest, and then it's just the woman and Jesus. And he looks up at her and he says, woman, where are your accusers? And she says, Master, they're gone. I don't know where they've gone. And he says, well, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Think about what happened in that moment. Here is a woman who, she gets a new lease on life, literally. She thought she was going to be put to death. She didn't know what the outcome of her situation was going to be. And here's the master, the rabbi. I'm sure Jesus' reputation was already a part of her life. And he offers her forgiveness. And not only forgiveness in the moment, for forgiveness going forward. He helps her deal with her guilt. Now, what Jesus didn't do was say that her sin was okay. What Jesus was communicating is somebody would have to pay a price for that sin. The one who was condemned for her sin was the one who was condemned for our sin. Jesus took it upon himself. There's another part of this story that I think is important for us as well, is that while Jesus dealt with her guilt and offered her the freedom of forgiveness, he didn't take away the fact of her sin. This woman still had to go home. She still had to deal with people who had been disappointed in her by choices she'd made in her life. But she had a whole new ground upon which to build those relationships. In fact, dealing with the consequences of her sin probably gave her a whole new opportunity to express grace. I believe that that's what God did, even though we don't read the rest of the story. It's what he's done for us. So don't let guilt hold you in bondage. Experience the freedom that God offers because of what Christ took upon the cross for you. And then deal with the consequences of your sin if you need to. But let's do it from a forgiven perspective. That's my thought for today.